Begin. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's webinar that will focus on global decline in ocean production underestimated by climate models, presented by CSIR Principal Researcher Dr. Tommy Ryan-Keogh. My name is Lehlohonolo Dau, a language editor at the CSIR. I will be facilitating today's session. Allow me to recognize the presence of everyone in attendance, including the members of the media. Thank you for joining us. Our session will commence with Dr. Tommy's presentation, followed by a question and answer segment. Should you have any questions, please share them in the chat box or perhaps utilize the raise a hand function to be acknowledged during that time. We will also address questions that will be shared on YouTube. Please note that Dr. Tommy is also available for interviews. To schedule one with him, please liaise with Kulani Chauke, our Media Relations Manager, or Petolo Patsibi, our Media Practitioner. Without wasting any time, I will now hand over to Dr. Tommy for his presentation. Over to you, Doc.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining me today to listen to me speak about this recent study that we published. Before I continue, I would just like to thank my co-authors, Dr. Sandy Tamala, who is based here at the CSIR, and also Professor Alessandro Tagliabue, who is based at the University of Liverpool in the UK. So today we're going to speak about how climate models are underestimating the global decline in ocean primary production. But what do we mean by ocean primary production? In this animation I'm showing you here, it represents the seasonal cycle of ocean primary production across the globe. This is driven by phytoplankton, which are single-celled organisms that photosynthesize. When they photosynthesize, they take up CO2, and because of this, ocean primary production represents this major planetary flux of carbon across the globe. And in turn, it regulates both the global climate and it supports ocean ecosystem services, such as fisheries. But when we start to look at what the future predictions of ocean productivity look like, the message becomes really unclear. So in this figure I'm showing you here, we have the projections from 15 different individual Earth system models. And what we can see is that there's both a lack of consensus in the direction of change. Some suggest that productivity will increase by the end of the century, whilst others suggest that it will decrease. Also, the magnitude of this change is really, really large. And what this means is that when we average across all the models, which is this dark red line here, the change is negligible. It averages out very close to zero. But the uncertainty, which represents this shaded area around the dark line, gets very large by the end of the century. Now, this uncertainty poses an even greater problem for us. So if phytoplankton represent the base of the food chain, represented by this simple model up here, any changes to phytoplankton at the beginning will therefore impact fisheries at the end of this chain. And this uncertainty is propagated into these ocean ecosystem models. So currently how they are run, they choose one model that suggests that primary production will increase by the end of the century. They choose another model that suggests it will decrease. This means that we don't actually have a clear understanding of what our fisheries are going to look like by the end of the century. Now, this is a huge problem for food security, as over 3 billion people rely on seafood as their main protein source. And in some developing nations, this can be the main protein source for up to 50% of their population. So with all of these problems, we asked the question, do we have any observations over the current period which could help us to discriminate amongst these divergent model projections? The answer is yes. We can use satellites to do this. So we use satellite data products that ran from 1998 to 2023. We then applied 6 different ocean primary production algorithms to this data, and we calculated the annual mean trends for the past 26 years. So I'm going to show you now what some of these trends look like. And I just want to emphasize that anywhere you see on a map is red, it means that over the past 26 years, primary production is going up. Whereas if you see blue on the map, it means that primary production has been going down. So in the first 2 algorithms we looked at, they were dominated by more positive trends than negative trends. So overall, they seem to suggest that primary production has been increasing over the past 26 years. When we move to the next 2 algorithms, they're slightly more dominated by negative trends than positive trends. So overall, they're suggesting a slight decrease in primary production over the past 26 years. Our final two algorithms are almost completely dominated by negative trends, and they suggest very large decreases in primary production over the past 26 years. But which one of these algorithms can we trust? Well, if you consider going from the top to the bottom of these maps, what it basically represents is an increasing level of both algorithm complexity. So as time has gone on and we have understood more about ocean primary production, we have changed the sort of algorithms we use. And the most recent one, which is the final one in the bottom, that represents our most recent understanding. But also, when we compare these algorithms to measurements that we conduct in the field, also we see that the most recent algorithms are also the most accurate, those bottom two. But considering we can see that there is a wide variety of both positive and negative trends over the past 26 years, we wanted to ask the question, what mechanisms may be behind these trends? And to do so, we constructed what is known as a multiple linear regression model. Now, I'll take you through this. So we selected 3 potential environmental drivers that we think could be having an impact on both the positive trends in primary production and the negative trends. These include sea surface temperature, so how much have our oceans warmed over the past few decades? Chlorophyll, which is an estimate for how much phytoplankton biomass there is, and the mixed layer depth, which controls how much nutrients are supplied to phytoplankton in the surface ocean so that they may produce, so they may be able to undergo primary production. And what this basically means is that we will have a range of both positive and negative coefficients from this multiple linear regression model. Positive coefficients means that as the driver goes up, so does primary production, whereas a negative coefficient would mean that as this driver has been increasing, primary production has been going down. So in this graph, what we have done to simplify it is that we basically averaged across the globe. So it's just showing you from north to south what these coefficients look like. And this is a really nice, easy one to show that basically as chlorophyll goes up, so does primary production. And this makes sense. The more phytoplankton we have, the more primary production that is occurring. However, if we look at sea surface temperature in the next one, we have a problem. We have 5 algorithms that show that as sea surface temperatures have been increasing, particularly at the equator, primary production has been going down. There's only one algorithm which shows the opposite, that seems to suggest that as the oceans have been warming, primary production has been going up. And for our final potential environmental driver, we see that it's only really at the poles and the higher latitude regions in the north and the south that as the mixed layer depth has been increasing, there has been a decrease in primary production. Now, this is all very well and good. We have a great understanding of what we're able to observe over the current period. But the next question we wanted to ask was, well, how well do models represent these relationships? And the answer to that is not very well. So we performed the same analysis on 15 different Earth system models that are built in many different institutions across the globe. Their range of coefficients are represented here by the dark blue lines, and the gold shaded area represents the range of coefficients that we got from satellites. And what you can see from this is that some models don't place enough weight at all on the role of a warming ocean in driving trends in primary production. Some models are placing too much weight on the role of chlorophyll in driving trends, whereas for mixed layer depth in the final panel, in many models, the relationship is actually the complete opposite to what we are able to observe. Now, whilst this is a great visual description, we wanted to come up with a statistical and numerical approach to be more accurate in how we can directly compare observations and models to each other. And we found this method, which is called the Earth Mover's Distance, which roughly translates to the energy required to transform the shape of a distribution of coefficients from observations to those of the models. Now, I'll take time to explain this because this did take me a little while to really understand what it meant. So in the top 2 graphs, you can see that there is the blue line that represents the coefficients from, and the red line represents the coefficients from the model. And you can see that they're actually quite similar in shape and size. So when we calculate the energy to transform the red distribution into the blue blue distribution, which is represented there by the gray line, it has a very small Earth movers distance value. Conversely, if we look at the bottom two graphs, where the red distribution is vastly different from the blue distribution, it requires a lot more energy to transform it. And as such, its Earth movers distance value is a lot larger. So small Earth movers distance values means that the models more closely match those of the observations. With this method in mind, we split the global ocean up into distinct regions. We then calculated these Earth movers distance values for each of these regions. Then we looked at, well, how big is that ocean region out of the whole global ocean? So big areas are represented by larger percent numbers here, such as the South Pacific or the North Pacific, whereas smaller areas have a much smaller numbers, so that we could then weight all of these Earth movers distance values, as in, if the models are getting it right in a large area, we want to know. If it's not getting it right in a smaller area of the ocean, it shouldn't really count for much. With all of these numbers that we generated, we needed to keep finding a way to reduce this down so that we could build a model ranking system. And the way in which we did this is that we averaged the Earth movers distance across our three environmental drivers: sea surface temperature, chlorophyll, and mixed layer depth. We then used this average and standard deviation to calculate a Z-score, and then we ranked these Z-scores from smallest to highest. And what it means is that when you have a very low Z-score, it means that the model is getting the relationships correct. It more closely matches that we were able to observe from satellites. Whereas if you have a very high Z-score number, it means that the model is performing really badly, and it would be ranked very low using our approach. And just before I go on to actually show you the model rankings, I'm just going to explain what the graphs will show. So on the y-axis, we have what is the change in primary production between now and the end of the century. So positive numbers means that it suggests that primary production will be increasing by the end of the century, whereas negative numbers means it will be decreasing. And along the x-axis, we have the rankings. So from the highest ranked model, which will be in position number 1, to our lowest ranked model in position 15. And what we found is that 5 out of our 6 satellite algorithms all agree. They all suggest that models which project declines in primary production are ranked highest, as in those models are best able to replicate the relationships we are currently observing in the ocean. Only one of the algorithms rank the opposite. It suggests that models which project future declines in primary production are much more likely. But if you remember what I said at the beginning about which algorithms we trust the most because of how complex they are and how accurate they are compared to field measurements, it's these two on the bottom. And they both agree. Models which project future declines are the most likely. They are considered to be the best models, which is great. We now have a model ranking system. However, these models are still estimating the ongoing production from satellites and models. And in the models, we've calculated over the contemporary period, so the same 26 years of the satellites, which is all there in purple, and then future, which is in gold, and that's between now and the end of the century. So you can see that our best performing satellite algorithms, they predict that the primary production has been declining between 7 to 10% across the globe. Now, even our highest ranked models, which are all the ones to the right-hand side that I've highlighted there, both their trends over the current period and the future period are all close to 1%. So even our best models that are getting these relationships as close as they can are not accurately predicting the change in the ocean productivity over the current period, which means that we also don't have a lot of faith of what they predict for the future period. And the reason for this is, again, we will come back to this same graph. Even those best models are still not getting these relationships completely right. And so future climate models are going to have to be able to best replicate these relationships in order to improve their predictions. So just to conclude, satellites have provided us with a multi-decadal data set over the past 26 years, which we was able to use to discriminate amongst different models' projections. We built a ranking system by assessing how well models build their primary production driver relationships and comparing them to what the satellite relationships are. Our highest ranked models were always associated with future declines in primary production. That is the most likely scenario. However, the magnitude of this decline is still being underestimated. And this is because even though they are considered the best models, their relationships are still not completely 100% correct. And what does this mean for us? Well, on this figure I'm showing you here is the global CO2 emissions from now and showing the projected CO2 emissions into the future. And there are two different pathways we can take. In the top, we have our low mitigation scenarios. So we don't reduce our CO2 emissions and we don't move towards green economies. We will see very large increases in temperature, anywhere between an increase of 3.6 to 4.4 degrees Celsius. This would result in very large decreases in ocean productivity, which means we will lose a lot of ocean ecosystem services. Conversely, the bottom scenarios represent different mitigation pathways we can take. So we can begin to reduce our CO2 emissions and our reliance on fossil fuels. We'll end up with a lot lower increases in temperatures, only between 1.4 to 2.7 degrees Celsius. This means that we will have much smaller decreases in ocean productivity in the future, and we won't necessarily lose all of our ocean ecosystem services. So the message I want for you to take away today is the more that we mitigate now, the less ocean primary production will decline in the future. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Tommy, for your presentation. At this particular moment, we are going to review the questions that have come through. Those in attendance, remember, should you have any questions, please make use of the chat box, or perhaps you can also make use of the raise a hand function to ask your question. I will also check in with Lindy if we do have any questions on YouTube. Let me quickly check if there are any in the chat box. Right, I don't seem to have any. Let's check in with Lindy. Lindy, do we have any questions on YouTube?
Good morning, everyone. No, we don't have any questions as yet.
Okay. Right, we do have a few individuals typing, so let's just give them a moment. All right, we have a question that has popped up from Kristen Engel. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, from Daily Maverick. And the question is, how urgent is this issue and what timeline are we looking at for potential irreversible consequences? Over to you, Doc.
So the best time to begin mitigating and reducing our CO2 emissions was yesterday, and the next best time is today. We need to start reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. Being able to accurately predict when we could see potentially irreversible consequences is a huge avenue of research. And we still don't have a complete accurate understanding, because even our satellite estimates, they're still just estimates. So we still don't know when we could see a tipping point switch in the ocean. But what I'm proposing here is that we do now have an understanding of what the models are projecting. And so if we want to reverse this, we need to start as soon as possible.
All right. Thank you, Kristen, for that question. And we have a question from Dimakatso Leshoro. And the question is, don't know if you're able to answer this, but what does this mean for economies depending on fishing? Could we see these industries disappearing over time?
That's a complex one, because making the direct link between phytoplankton to fisheries is not an easy task to do so. And you can see that from the projections we showed, at least from the satellite, is that there are some areas where it may go up and some areas where it may go down. So the effect will not be globally universal. We could see that in some countries, their fisheries may be okay and they could be sustained towards the end of the century, whereas some fisheries in certain countries could decline. And because of the importance of food security, we should really begin considering ways in which we can prevent the bottom of the food web from declining or disappearing.
All right. Thank you, Dimakatso, for that question. Or perhaps if you feel that your questions have not been adequately addressed or you do have follow-up questions, please raise them. And I see that Kristen is still typing. Let's quickly check with Lindy. Just check in with Lindy if we do have any questions on YouTube.
Thank you, Dimakatso.
No other questions on YouTube.
All right. Thanks, Lindy.
Thanks.
Right. We will just await Kristen's question to come through. All right, we're still waiting for the question to come through. All right. Kristen says, thank you for the response, Doc. Could you also perhaps speak a bit more about what the decline in ocean productivity means for the general public?
Yep. So beyond the impact that I've spoken here on fisheries, we also have to consider how the important role they play in regulating our global climate. And phytoplankton, when they photosynthesize, up carbon dioxide, and when they sink and they die, they can sink to the bottom of the ocean where that carbon can become trapped for hundreds to thousands of years. Right? And it's because of the ocean's role that the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere aren't much higher than they should be at the moment. It plays a very important role in regulating our global climate. However, if the phytoplankton are no longer able to undergo primary production at the same levels, then they will take up less CO2 as time goes on, which means more will remain in the atmosphere, and climate change will get even worse than what we're currently seeing now with extreme weather events across the globe.
All right. Thank you, Kristen, for that question. I hope it has been addressed adequately. I see the Makatso is also coming through, just typing a question as well. Just to check in with Lindy, any questions on your side?
There was one question, but I asked him to elaborate. It just says RFQ for other service providers, but I'm not sure what that means, or if you are able to answer that, if it's a bit vague. They haven't elaborated yet, so.
All right, we'll just await them to just revise their question.
It was a little bit. It was a little while ago, so I think we can carry on. If something comes up, I'll put up my hand.
All right. Okay.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Lindy.
Sure.
All right, Doctor, we're just gonna wait for Dimakatso, as I see that they're still typing. All right, and it has come through. Is your message receiving resonance among leaders, you think? Because there seems to be more talk than action regarding addressing climate change adaptation.
This is a really interesting question. So if you remember the problem I presented at the beginning, where we looked at the future projections of production from climate models, when we average them together, that's what gets presented to policymakers. So what we showed was that actually the net change is zero. So from a policy perspective, they would be looking at it and going, well, there's going to be no change. So that's why us as climate scientists, we've tried to figure out, well, is there a way we can improve that messaging? And that's what we hope we have done here in this study by suggesting that actually those models which project future declines are much more likely, and that can be a much clearer message we give to policymakers to say, this is what we think is the most likely scenario. So if we don't act now and we don't mitigate this change, these will be the negative impacts that could be occurring by the end of the century.
All right. Thank you, Demarcus, for that question. Are there any other questions, perhaps, that we have? All right. I see Kristen is still typing. Lindy, I would request that perhaps if the individual has come back to you or rectified or clarified the question, you will just let me know. All right, we're still waiting for Kristen as he's typing the question. And the question has come through, and it says, following on that, what further actions are needed now from policymakers, scientists, and the public to implement more efficient mitigation measures?
So from scientists, we need to be better at giving our message, making it clearer to both policymakers and to the public about how important our oceans are for sustaining the planet and all the livelihoods we see around us, so that we can then get public opinion to also join us in applying the appropriate pressure on policymakers to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, to switch to more renewable energy sources whilst still being able to maintain functioning societal services.
All right. Thank you, Kristen, for that question. Should you perhaps still have any follow-up questions, please bring them forth. Right. I see that Dimakato is also typing. All right, just give us a few minutes as we await the questions to come through. All right, our attendees are still typing the questions. I see the Makato and Kristen are both typing. And Dimakato's question has popped through. Moving away from fossil fuels doesn't seem practical for Africa in particular or the global south without funding. What should be happening then in the meantime while the north decides whether it wants to fund mitigation and adaptation efforts?
This is a really difficult problem for countries in Africa, particularly because of the lack of funding to do so. I don't have a complete answer for that, but what I will emphasize is that in most climate projections, it is the global south and developing nations that will be hit the hardest in the future. So we are reliant on the global north to try and provide us with that funding mechanisms. But if they don't, we may have to try and source it for ourselves, because they won't feel the largest impacts. It will be the global south.
Thank you, Limakatsu, for that question. And I see that Kristen approves. Perhaps he had a similar question. All right, I see he's also typing. We'll just give him a moment to send his question through. And Kristen, has said, thank you, Doctor, and the CSIR team. That's all from me for now. Lindy, let me just check in with you. Are there any other questions?
No
Yes,
other
sir.
questions from YouTube. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Lindy. I see the Makatso has also shared the same sentiments, thanking you for the presentation, and that should be about it. All right, if we do not have any other questions, I believe this then marks the end of our session or webinar today. Thank you so much to everyone that has come through and joined us for this insightful webinar. And we hope that should you have any questions, remember, or perhaps interviews, remember that Dr. Tommy is available to address any questions that you might have or to clarify some of the points that were dealt with today. Our media relations manager is available, Gulani Chauke. Just liaise with him, get a hold of him, and he will assist accordingly. Thank you, everyone, for coming through, and this is just about it. Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Tommy.
Thank you, everyone, for joining me today.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, colleagues.